I've been getting a bit frustrated by discussing politics all the time, folks. I'm going to veer off in the left field and hop down the rabbit hole with a nifty conspiracy theory story or two. I know what you're thinking. Oh boy, Vincent's going off the deep end, and he's going to start talking about aliens and Bigfoot. Well, maybe we will explore these topics eventually, but for now we're going to keep the discussion based on actual data and legal case files. Every year, people go missing from national parks and forests in the United States. Oftentimes, huge search operations are organized and go on for weeks with extensive local news coverage. After the first week or two, though, the coverage dies off quietly, perhaps with the announcement that the search has been called off. Most of us assume the worst, and that nature's claimed yet another innocent life, reminding us that she is indeed an unforgiving mistress. For most of these cases, you'd be correct. The usual causes are animal predation, drowning, disorientation, and or getting injured in an out-of-the-way location, and as well as exposure, and that can explain 99% of missing cases in national parks. Every so often, there's a case that defies logic and reason. Hell, it can defy how we understand the laws of nature. You might be asking, what's so suspicious about people going missing in the forest and the wild? Well, when this first started being investigated by a man named David Pallades, he filed a Freedom of Information Act for a list of missing people in all national parks in the United States. The Park Services has a large police force that's highly trained and professional, with jurisdiction on federal park property. His request for a list of missing people was at first denied. They said no such list existed. As a matter of fact, a lawyer called him up and asked him why he wanted the list. That actually violates a lot of protocol. The National Park Service claimed that they relied on the institutional memory of its employees to remember who had never been found. Obviously, this isn't true. Every small and medium police department in the country has a list of missing people. To suggest that the National Park Service does not is ridiculous. They have a list of every movie that has been filmed in a national park. Why wouldn't they keep a list of people that have gone missing in national parks? After requesting the information again, they told David they'd be providing it, but it would cost him $1 million for them to collect the data for him. This is a highly unusual response. It's obviously an attempt at stonewalling his information request. They also told him that even though he was a published author, his books weren't found in enough public libraries for them to provide the information. This is a made-up reason. There's nothing in the legislation that states this. Their attempts at stonewalling was successful, though. But Mr. Pallades began collecting the data and lists himself, and will be using a lot of his data for this video. The cases we'll look at have a few commonalities that eliminate most common reasons for a disappearance. 1. They weren't killed by animals. That is to say, there's no evidence or blood trails or disturbances or signs of violence that are involved in the case. 2. They were, by all accounts, not suicidal, and they did not intentionally wander off. 3. They didn't drown in any bodies of water. All streams and ponds were searched and dug, and no remains were found. 4. There was a search expedition for them, and if the remains were found, they were found in a location they could not have possibly have reached. Or the location had been searched previously. 5. Dogs brought in to track them refused to do so, or they couldn't find a scent. These next few cases, we've made certain that all these criteria were met. Number 1. Dennis Martin, June 14th, 1969. In 1969, Dennis Martin was camping with his family in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. One of 4 siblings, Dennis was the youngest, and had been hiking with his family along the Appalachian Trail. They stopped to rest at a popular hiking spot called Spence Field. This is when the first in a series of strange events occurred. Another family had stepped off the trail and introduced themselves, also as the Martin family, and they asked if their children could play with Dennis and his brothers. Bill and Clyde Martin Dennis's father and grandfather agreed and lay down on the grass to relax with the other family. The boys decided to play a prank on the adults as they sat talking in the grass. 3 of the older brothers went on one side of the trail, and Dennis, who was wearing a bright red shirt, went on the other. They would jump out and spook their parents. A silly, simple, harmless prank that thousands of kids have done to their parents in the past. And it resulted with 3 boys jumping out, but with Dennis only a few yards away from the others, never coming out of his hiding spot. Bill Martin later said that he'd watched Dennis walk behind some shrubs to hide, and he'd been keeping an eye on him. Dennis was a special needs kid. I mean, he was a slow learner, and he was in a special education program. So his father kept a good watch on him. Time stretched on, and little Dennis never jumped out and tried to startle him. His father checked the bushes, and Dennis was nowhere to be found. He began running down the trail, calling his son's names, and he said he thought he heard a reply or two at first, but wasn't certain if it was just his hopeful imaginations. Only 3 minutes had passed since he initially stepped behind those bushes. Clyde hiked in the opposite direction to the east and tried to find any trace of Dennis with no success. They informed the park rangers, and a search commenced until night when heavy rain began falling. The search was called off until the next day. It should also be noted that in many of these cases, inclement weather immediately following the event is a commonality. From here, things started getting weird. Weirder, I should say. A large search and rescue operation began the next day with specialized searchers. Over the next 2 weeks, the search effort swelled to 1,400 people, along with 1,100 helicopter flights. Eventually, the official search began on June 14th and stopped at the beginning of July. The unofficial searches continued until September. Much to everyone's surprise, a few days after the search started, a unit of Green Berets showed up, fully armed, to help search for the boy. Now, most of you watching this probably doesn't mean anything special. To me and my military family, it's a big question mark and a huge red flag. Special forces do not show up for missing children. National Guard might. Green Berets? No. Armed? No. Working completely separate from the main search effort? No. Not communicating with it? Why on earth would they do that? It just doesn't happen. I mean, this is in 1969, during Vietnam. I asked a Green Beret who was active during that time period, and he blinked at me in surprise before telling me nothing's changed since 1969. He didn't even believe me when I asked him the question. Green Berets do not show up to search for missing people, child or no child. Another odd fact is 2 hours after Dennis disappeared, roughly 3 miles away from Spence Field over rough terrain, there was another family. The Key family reported to rangers that they had heard the scream of a child. When they looked up on the hillside where it came from, they saw a large, unkempt, hairy man carrying what looked like a child on his back. The Rangers never investigated this claim because the FBI decided it was impossible for the child to cover that much distance. The FBI never even told Dennis's father about this, his only lead in the case. It was as if they were keeping the information from him on purpose. Later, however, Bill Martin and the lead investigator, a man named McCarter, they actually traveled the route that the hairy man would have taken from Spence Field to the spot where the Key family sighting took place. They discovered while it would be in the realm of possibility for adults to make that distance in that time, a child couldn't have done so under any reasonable circumstance. So why did the FBI refuse to tell Mr. Martin about the only lead to find his missing son? McCarter also stated that a few months prior to this incident, that a ranger in the area had been assaulted by a wild man living off the grid. This was before park rangers carried sidearms, and apparently the ranger had been injured pretty badly. Could this wild man be one of many that live out in the backwoods, undetected by most people, and could they have snatched up the child? I guess it's a possibility. But no trace of Dennis Martin was ever found. Not a stitch of clothing, not a drop of blood, and no scent for dogs to follow. It was as if he was snatched off the face of the earth without any trace. Why was Special Forces present? The same source, the same Green Beret, and my own experience, tells me that they were there for a reason other than a missing child. Could they have been there to look for the backwoods people that kidnapped the boy? Who possibly have kidnapped the boy? Most likely, we'll never know. But as mysterious as this case is, it's only the beginning into our trip into the unknown. It only gets stranger and stranger still. Case 2. Henry McCabe. On September 6th, 2015, 32-year-old Henry, a Minnesota Revenue Department employee, was out at a club with some friends. He had been drinking, and one of his friends had taken his wallet to cut him off. He left the club, headed home, and he convinced his ride to let him off at a gas station around 2:30 a.m. This was the last time that Henry was seen alive. His wife received a call from Henry's phone, but she was asleep and didn't answer it. A voicemail, however, unlike anything I've ever heard before, was left. I have to warn you, if you have not heard this before, you may find it frightening and disturbing.
Thing you've ever heard before. There are 2 minutes worth of noises, bizarre ones, but very little actual talking. Authorities confirmed the disturbing middle-of-the-night call came from Henry McCabe's cell phone. It was Labor Day, September 7th at 2:28 in the morning. McCabe's worried wife heard the message.
Isn't my cell phone connected?
Minnesota Community Policing Services is a nonprofit agency and acts as a go-between with police and the Liberian community. The leader is trying to help the family make some sense of this recording.
The growls turned to high-pitched moans.
Like he's moaning in pain?
Like moaning in pain.
The tortured grunts suddenly stop. There is silence. Then someone, either Henry or another person, says, "Stop it."
I try to picture where he was, what it might have been like, what circumstances would have made him sound like that.
The voicemail is in stark contrast to other articulate recordings of McCabe speaking at an event. He's a state auditor.
What is the justification? What is the right thing to do?
The message is one piece of evidence Mounds View police are reviewing. The police chief tells me even the FBI is analyzing the recording and voices for clues. The chief says the investigation took deputies here on Tuesday to Rice Creek Park, which borders New Brighton, Mounds View, and Fridley, all areas where McCabe was reported seen or a cell phone ping placed him. Ramsey County Water Patrol searched, but came up empty.
Guttural, animalistic cries of pain can be heard for nearly 2 minutes. The voicemail ends with someone saying, "Stop it," before cutting off. I don't know about you, but I could barely listen to that without imagining some pretty horrific things. Those cries, I've never heard anyone scream and groan like that. I've seen people wounded badly, and while they make noise, this sounded almost animalistic. Search parties dispatched to find Henry revealed nothing until 2 months later when a kayaker found his body in Rush Lake, an area that had been searched previously before. What had caused Henry to make those noises? The cause of death was drowning. At least that's what the coroner said. There was no signs of trauma to his body, and his body was found 7 miles away from where he was dropped off. How did Henry reach that lake while drunk, without a wallet, and severely intoxicated? Case 3. Gabe. On June 12, 2005, Gabe, who lived with his cousin, attended a bonfire at an apple orchard in Kosnovia, Michigan. During the party, he told his friends he was tired and he was going to walk home to his house. No one thought it was odd because he lived so close by. It was shortly after midnight. From between 12:47 to 12:57 a.m., McCabe made a few calls that were rather odd. He called one friend and said, "I've had enough." He called another, and all he said was, "I'm in a field," before the phone went dead. At that point, there were no further calls. A massive 1,500 search operation with aircraft began and scoured the orchard area as well as the road he'd been expected to take home. They completed this search 3 times, and like the other cases, not a trace of him was found. That is, until 3 weeks later, on July 2nd, 2005. His body was found in a pond that was in the middle of the area that had been professionally searched 3 times. His body was standing upright in the pond with his head and shoulders breaking the water. The autopsy revealed that he had a blood alcohol of 0.12, and the coroner ruled the death as accidental drowning due to alcohol. Case solved, or is it? An independent investigation by a forensic pathologist hired by the family determined that although Todd had been missing for 3 weeks, he'd only been dead for 2 to 5 days. There was also no water in the man's lungs. He was fully clothed, and there was no signs of trauma on his body. Where was Todd during the 2 weeks that he was still alive? Why would his body show up in an area that had been searched so many times in the condition that it was in? There are a lot of questions and very few answers. And these are just a few of thousands of people that have disappeared under strange circumstances. These people were either never found or found dead. In the next video, I'll cover a few cases where people were found alive, albeit under circumstances and with stories that are as mysterious and unbelievable as the 3 I've covered here. I hope you've enjoyed this first edition of my creepy video series, and I promise I'm starting off slowly. And I do have a theory that connects all these cases together. I don't want to spoil the fun of discovering it together, though. I really want to hear your opinions and comments, and I want you to know that all these cases are available to look at online. Feel free to donate to my Patreon and follow me on Twitter. Retweet it if you enjoyed it. I hope you guys didn't watch this in the dark. Pleasant dreams, everyone.